Thanks to Shopify for supporting Future Hindsight. Shopify is a platform designed for anyone to sell anywhere, giving entrepreneurs like myself the resources once reserved for big business. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful, all lowercase. And if you need more Future Hindsight in your life, sign up for the newsletter. It's easy and free, and it's a fantastic way to support the show. When you're finished with the episode, head to futurehindsight.com to sign up. Welcome to Future Hindsight, a podcast on a mission to spark civic action. I'm your host, Mila Atmos. I'm a global citizen based in New York City, and I'm deeply curious about the way our society works. So each week I bring you conversations to cut through the confusion around today's most important civic issues and share clear, actionable ways for us to build a brighter future together. After all, democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. What if I told you that the document we've been taught to revere, the very foundation of American democracy, might actually be responsible for the current crisis in government? And what's more, that it may be leading us not toward a more perfect union, but toward destruction and even secession. Our guest today is Erwin Chemerinsky, Dean of the UC Berkeley School of Law and one of the nation's leading constitutional scholars. His most recent book is No Democracy Lasts Forever: How the Constitution Threatens the United States. It urges us to think about starting over. Erwin, welcome to Future Hindsight. Thank you for joining us.
Such a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with what keeps you up at night. You're not only saying that the Constitution has flaws, but you're saying it's leading us toward destruction and possibly secession. So I want to make sure that people are understanding the stakes. Tell us more about the elements in the Constitution that are pushing us toward potential destruction.
I think it's important to emphasize that I finished writing this book in the summer of 2023. I chose the title, No Democracy Lasts Forever, in September of 2023. So it's not a book that's responding to the November 2024 election, which occurred in the first months of the Trump presidency. And to answer your question, I believe the choices that were made in writing the Constitution are now really haunting us. The Electoral College, 2 senators per state. I think it's all made worse by the House of Representatives being very gerrymandered. Life tenure for Supreme Court justices. Also being made worse by Supreme Court decisions that have allowed corporations to spend unlimited amounts of money in elections and gutted the Voting Rights Act. And choices that were made with regard to race and slavery back in 1787.
You've just illustrated how things have become worse. But you actually make a strong argument that the origin story of the Constitution explains so much about what's wrong. And you trace the problem back to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. So it was actually not a time that's dissimilar to the current time. There was a lot of division. The Articles of Confederation were a failure, and to get everyone on board to sign on to a new constitution required compromises. What are those compromises, and how do they shape a document that continues to govern us now, centuries later?
One of the things that I teach my students is that everything in the Constitution was a compromise. There was no agreement on how to choose the president. There are those who believed, as I do now, that the winner of the popular vote should become president of the United States. There were those who tremendously distrusted the people, and they wanted the state legislatures or even Congress to choose the president. Ultimately, it was a compromise to create the Electoral College, where each state would choose electors, and they would decide who was the president. The Electoral College was also chosen as a way to try to increase the political strength of states that enslaved populations. The states that had slavery were concerned that their enslaved populations wouldn't count in choosing the president. But prior to coming up with the way of choosing the president through the Electoral College, it was decided that enslaved individuals would count as 3/5 of a person for allocating seats in the House of Representatives. Seats in the Electoral College are the number of representatives plus the number of senators. So Hugh Williamson, a delegate to the Constitutional Convention from North Carolina, James Madison, a delegate from Virginia, praised the Electoral College precisely because it would help so-called slave states. The Electoral College didn't matter in the 20th century. Not once was someone elected by the Electoral College who had lost the popular vote. But twice in this century, in 2000 and 2016, the loser of the popular vote became president, and it almost happened again in 2004 and 2020. Population shifts, partisan realignment make it likely in the future, and I think it's a disaster for democracy to have a president who lost the popular vote.
Yeah, totally agree. So you actually say that an argument can be made that Article 2 is unconstitutional in order to get rid of the Electoral College or to fix the Electoral College problem because the Fifth Amendment guarantees equal protection. So the Supreme Court, of course, has ruled that part of equal protection is one person, one vote. And so everyone must have an equal ability to influence elections. Now, we both know, of course, that the Supreme Court is unlikely right now to rule that Article 2 is unconstitutional. But still, walk us through the argument of how this would work.
I actually think it's clear that the Electoral College is unconstitutional, though I don't think the Supreme Court's going to come to that conclusion. In 1954, in Bowling versus Sharp, the Supreme Court said that the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which applies to the federal government, includes a requirement for equal protection of the laws. The 14th Amendment, that has an equal protection clause, applies only to state and local governments. The Supreme Court has made it clear that a core of equal protection is one person, one vote. For any elected bodies, all individuals have to have the same influence. Only 2 elected bodies in the United States that deviate from one person, one vote: the United States Senate and the Electoral College. Now, you would say, how can a provision in the Constitution be unconstitutional? Well, that's because amendments to the Constitution modify the text. And so it is that one could argue that the Electoral College violates the amendment that assures equal protection.
Right. Well, like you said, it's unlikely this Supreme Court will rule that and will not come to the conclusion that you've just come to. And another way to fix the Electoral College problem, which you point out in the book, is for the Supreme Court to rule that the winner-take-all approach to allocate electoral votes is unconstitutional. It should be proportional. And again, we know it's unlikely, but please explain how the argument would work.
The Electoral College is provided for in the Constitution. It is highly unlikely there will be a constitutional amendment to change it, because the small states that benefit from the Electoral College won't vote for an amendment, and it would take 3/4 of the states for this or any other constitutional amendment. But winner-take-all is not in the Constitution. 48 of 50 states use winner-take-all in allocating their electors. Only Maine and Nebraska don't. What this means is if somebody voted for Donald Trump in California in November 2024, their vote didn't matter. Kamala Harris got all of the electoral votes from California. Or correspondingly, if somebody voted for Kamala Harris in Texas in November 2024, their vote didn't matter. I think there's a strong argument that winner-take-all violates the Constitution by giving no weight at all to those who are in the minority. At the very least, Congress could pass a law that says that every state must allocate its electors roughly proportionate to the popular vote. So if a candidate got 60% of the popular vote in a state, they should get 60% of the electors. And the candidate get 40%, should still get some electors. Studies show that if winner-take-all was eliminated, it would make it much less likely that we'd have the Electoral College be choosing somebody who lost the popular vote as the president of the United States.
Yes. Well, you mentioned earlier that the way that the Senate is configured is anti-democratic. And you mentioned that there are 2 senators per state, no matter how large the state is. So notably, Wyoming has about 600,000 people, and California has about 40 million. Also, there are more people living in the District of Columbia, which has no senators, than in Wyoming. So it's pretty obvious that the system of apportioning senators is unfair and not democratic. But it's difficult to fix the problem with the Senate. Tell us why.
I think that this is one of those problems that I was alluding to that was a result of a compromise that was made in 1787. The most populous states at the Constitutional Convention wanted representation in Congress to be allocated by population. The least populous states wanted every state to have equal representation. So there was a compromise. Have a House of Representatives where representation is allocated based on population, and a Senate where every state got 2 senators. At the time the Constitution was written, it was a relatively small difference between the largest state and the smallest state in population. You just pointed out that now California has 68 times more people than Wyoming, but they each get 2 senators. To put this in another way, in the first 2 years of the Biden presidency, there were 50 Democratic senators and 50 Republican senators. The 50 Democratic senators represented 42 million more people than the 50 Republican senators. There's no way to reconcile this with the most elemental principles of a democracy. But now to get to your question, why is it difficult to change? Article 5 of the Constitution, which concerns amendments, lists 2 parts of the Constitution that could not be changed. One of them is that every state would have equal representation in the Senate.
So what's the way around this? You mentioned that we could maybe have more states, which is unlikely to happen, obviously. But what's a way that if you wanted to change it to make the Senate somehow more democratic, even a little bit?
Well, even a little bit, it would be creating additional states. I mean, grant statehood, for example, to the District of Columbia, to Puerto Rico. There's been talk at times about splitting some of the larger states, like California, into smaller ones. And doing that would help to at least lessen what the problem is right now. Short of that, this is a problem that's not going to be solved until someday there's a new constitution. Because it is a provision of the Constitution, 2 senators per state, that can't be changed except through a new constitution. There can't be a constitutional amendment here because Article 5 precludes that.
Right. I want to get to having a new constitution. But before we get there, you mentioned at the very top of our conversation that the problems of the Constitution have been made worse over time by changes in our society. For example, massive population growth, the Senate becoming even more anti-democratic, for example, through the practice of the filibuster, partisan gerrymandering you mentioned, a lawless Supreme Court, the enduring racial inequalities that stem from slavery, and the more recent problems, of course, with the internet and social media endangering democracy. So we don't really have time to discuss every single one of them here, but of these, which one do you think is the most important to address sooner rather than later?
It's hard to answer that because I want to say there are many things we need to address.
Yes.
Let me point to one, and I think that it's one that could be fixed. And this is partisan gerrymandering for the House of Representatives. Partisan gerrymandering is the political party that controls the legislature, draws election districts to maximize, say, seats for that party. It's nothing new. It takes its name from a governor of Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry, early in American history. But what's changed is because of sophisticated computer programs and voter information, it's possible to draw election districts with far more precision with regard to partisan gerrymandering than ever before. Justice Elena Kagan remarked, "This isn't your grandparents' partisan gerrymandering." So take the state of North Carolina, which was the subject of litigation. It's a purple state. If you look at elections for Congress, Democrats and Republicans statewide get almost the same number of votes. But because of partisan gerrymandering, Republicans win usually 10 or 14 seats. Same thing could be said in states like Pennsylvania, where even though Republicans and Democrats statewide get the same number of votes for seats for Congress, Republicans win a disproportionate number of seats. A bill passed the House of Representatives that would have created independent districting commissions for House seats in Congress. And Congress, though not this Congress, could fix this.
Yes. Well, not this, but yes, Congress can, but not this iteration of the Congress. So we've been talking about working within the construct of the existing Constitution without really necessarily making amendments, which are, of course, very hard to ratify. And, of course, I agree with you that we should try nonetheless. You also note that we can have a constitutional convention, and you're confident that the U.S. will eventually have a new constitution. You said that this democracy is likely to die. All democracies die. So the current crisis will definitely come to a head. If we were to start from scratch, what's your vision for a new constitutional convention for the 21st century and beyond? What fundamental principles would guide this reimagining?
I'm so glad you framed it as you did. I believe that so many of the problems can be solved, should be solved, must be solved without a constitutional convention. And we've talked about some of those things already. But you're right. I believe that ultimately there will be a new constitution for the United States. Probably not in my lifetime, but no constitution, no form of government lasts forever. And there'll be a point at which our society concludes it just doesn't make sense to continue to be governed by a document written in 1787 for an agrarian slave society. And so I think it's important to begin thinking about how would we have a constitutional convention? I don't think we should follow the procedures of Article 5 of the Constitution, and this would allow 2/3 of the states to call for a constitutional convention to be convened by Congress. I think we should try to think about how to best devise a procedure for a constitutional convention that will produce a document that's likely to pass and that will do a good job of governing us. There's an analogy here. The Articles of Confederation, which preceded the Constitution, said that it would take unanimous consent of the states to change it. When the Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, called for a constitutional convention, it was actually with the charge to revise the Articles of Confederation. When they got to Philadelphia in 1787, they took onto themselves a much larger task, writing a new constitution. And ratification of it didn't follow the procedures that were prescribed in the Articles of Confederation. Article 7 of the Constitution says if 3/4 of the states ratified it, it was then in effect. It discarded the unanimity requirement from the Articles of Confederation. At the time George Washington was elected president, North Carolina and Rhode Island hadn't yet ratified the Constitution. Rhode Island didn't do so until a year into the George Washington presidency. So what I'd like to see is a mechanism for a constitutional convention that provides broad representation of people throughout the United States. It has to be as bipartisan as it is possible to make it. It has to be as representative as possible, and to charge them with, over a period of time, drafting a new constitution. And I believe that that new constitution, their proposal, should be put to the people of the United States for a vote. A national plebiscite, as is done in other countries. It shouldn't be sent back to the states to ratify, because the states aren't going to ratify a new constitution that decreases the power of some states.
Well, in a way, I feel like one of the problems of the Constitution is that it elevates states over people. You know, that the states have the rights as opposed to the people, the way that the country was constituted. We'll be back with Erwin in just a moment, so stay with us. You won't want to miss this episode's Civic Spark. One small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, I want to tell you about the early days of Future Hindsight. It was exciting and new and inspiring and really hard. Whenever you start out on a new journey, it feels like you have to figure everything out all on your own. In the case of Future Hindsight, that was finding guests, recording the episodes, editing everything. The list keeps going. It's an overwhelming feeling when every day seems to introduce another question that needs an answer. But that's the name of the game when you're starting something new. Your to-do list just grows and grows with new tasks every day. And to tell you the truth, that list can pretty easily take over your life. But what if you could find the right tool that not only helps you out, but simplifies everything? Because that can be such a game changer. For millions of businesses out there, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the United States. From household names like Mattel and Alo Yoga to up-and-coming brands that are just getting started. So if you want to take that first step, do it with your own design studio. With hundreds of ready-to-use templates, Shopify helps you build a beautiful online store to match your brand style. And if you want to accelerate your content creation, Shopify is packed with helpful AI tools that write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography. That's a lot of great tools at your fingertips. And it means you can get the word out as if you have an entire marketing team behind you. In just a few quick minutes, you can easily create email and social media campaigns wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. It's so great to know that Shopify is your commerce expert with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and beyond. You heard it here. If you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. You see, what I love about Shopify is that no matter how big you want to grow, Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level. Turn your big business idea into cha-ching with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period and start selling today at shopify.com/hopeful. Go to shopify.com/hopeful. Shopify.com/hopeful. Cha-ching! We also want to share about a podcast called Assembly Required. It's hard not to want to tune out the news these days, but despite how overwhelming things feel, we are not powerless. Our job now is to pool what we've got and see what we can make happen. At Assembly Required, Stacey Abrams will face each executive order, legislative policy, and every news cycle, no matter how terrifying or absurd, by asking these questions. What can we do to learn more about what's happening? What can we do to solve problems, however small? And how can we find the kind of hope that can sustain our work in difficult times? Tune in to new episodes of Assembly Required every Thursday, wherever you get your podcasts, or on YouTube. And now, let's return to my conversation with Erwin Chemerinsky. So, you mentioned a plebiscite in other countries. How has your thinking evolved around events in, let's say, Chile, when they tried to have a new constitution and they had to have several runs at it?
Many countries have had their voters determine whether to approve a new constitution. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes it hasn't. There is certainly the possibility that the new constitution drafted by a constitutional convention could get rejected by the voters. Keep in mind, though, that the United States Constitution was almost rejected by the state conventions. In some states, the Constitution was approved by only a few votes at the constitutional conventions.
Well, I know I just mentioned that constitutional amendments are very difficult to enact. There have been, according to your book, 11,848 proposed amendments since 1789, and only 27 have been ratified by the states. So while it's a slim chance, it's not impossible. If you could wave a magic wand and change one part of the Constitution tomorrow, where would you start?
The Electoral College. I mean, there's many things I'd want to change: 2 senators per state, life tenure for Supreme Court justices, how difficult it is to amend the Constitution. But if I had to pick a starting place, it would get rid of the Electoral College.
Yeah, that is definitely a good place to start. So you mentioned that you wrote this book really in 2023. It came out in August of 2024, just before a momentous election. What has surprised you most about how your arguments have landed in this political moment? Because I feel like you pre-addressed the problems that we're going through today.
The title of the book, No Democracy Lasts Forever, seems almost prescient right now. I never thought I would be so afraid for the future of American democracy as I am right now. President Trump, in a myriad of executive orders, has shown no regard for the Constitution. At times, he's even suggested that he'll disobey court orders that require him to comply with the Constitution. And so I think that the underlying themes of the book are just as relevant now as when I wrote it. But I also think that the events since January 20th heightened the sense of there really is a crisis with regard to the Constitution and our democracy.
Yeah, there really is. So what do you make of the Supreme Court? Because I feel like a lot of the suggestions you made were like, if the Supreme Court could rule on this in the right way and have your interpretation, then a lot of these problems could be fixed, for example, the Electoral College. But it's unlikely.
On the one hand, I think that many of the problems in our democracy stem from the Supreme Court. I could start with the Supreme Court's tragic decisions with regard to race through so much of American history, and how the choices made in the Constitution with regard to race continue to haunt us. I can talk about how the Supreme Court has made the problems of democracy worse. In Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, the court allowing corporations to spend unlimited amounts of money from their corporate treasuries in elections. I could talk about how the Supreme Court has so undermined the Voting Rights Act. But at the same time, I would say that the Supreme Court right now is our most important guardrail for democracy. I was saying just a moment ago how afraid I am for democracy. But in the end, it's the Supreme Court that's there to enforce the Constitution and to check the president. So while I'm very critical of the Supreme Court for much of what it's done, I also believe the Supreme Court is more important at this moment in time than ever before.
So since Trump has taken office, is there a decision by the Supreme Court that makes you confident that they will, in fact, stand up for democracy?
The Supreme Court has had a mixed record in the first few months of the Trump presidency. On the one hand, I think the Supreme Court has done a good job of saying the government can't take people to a foreign country and hold them there without any due process of law. The Supreme Court has issued an order that no additional individuals can be taken to the maximum security prison in El Salvador. On the other hand, the Supreme Court has had a very mixed record responding to the Trump administration's illegal cutoff of funds. There was one case on March 5th where the Supreme Court 5-4 said that a federal district court could command that money that was cut off be spent. But then there was another case on April 4th that said that the federal courts could not order that the money be restored. There were 5-4 decisions in opposite directions with only Justice Amy Coney Barrett in the majority in both, and she didn't write to explain why she saw a difference. And there are other places where I've been very disappointed in the Supreme Court since January 20th. Mm-hmm. President Trump issued a ban on transgender individuals serving in the military. The lower federal courts stopped that. The Supreme Court has allowed it to go forward. The Trump administration has fired some executive officials in clear violation of federal statutes. The lower court stopped him. The Supreme Court's letting those firings go forward. So I think at this moment in time, it's impossible to tell how much the Supreme Court will be an effective check with regard to the Trump presidency. How much will the court be a real guardrail to protect our constitutional democracy?
Mm-hmm. I want to circle back to the idea of secession because I live in New York, and in New York, the only idea of secession that people talk about is New York City should secede from the state of New York. But people in Texas think about leaving. People in California think about leaving the Union. And we talked to Jeff Charlotte last year, and his assessment is that there's already a low-grade civil war happening across the United States. So in your mind, how possible is secession, and is amending the Constitution the cure? Like, can it prevent that?
I do not support secession. I think that secession would be disastrous economically. It'd be disastrous in terms of the balance of power relative to Russia and China. But on the other hand, I think we all have to ask the question, is what unites us as a country still greater than what divides us? We are so deeply divided as a country. And it's clear that the Trump presidency is not going to be a unifying presidency. It's going to further exacerbate the divisions. And so it's not surprising to me that people in California are starting to say, why should we be governed under policies that we so loathe? And so there will be, I think, an initiative on the ballot to try to get a sense of the popular support for the idea of secession. I predicted before the November election that if Trump won and if Republicans took control of both houses of Congress, we hear the first serious talk of secession since the Civil War. I don't think secession is going to happen anytime soon. As I said, I don't advocate it, but it's easy to understand why people are talking about it. Of course, the difficulty is that there's no mechanism in the Constitution for secession. Those who wrote the Constitution didn't want to create an out or the very mechanism for its destruction. That said, there was no mechanism for the United States Constitution either. Will there be a point at which some states say, we just want to go our own way? Or maybe there'll be a different kind of secession. Perhaps there'll be a radical devolution of powers to the states, where we keep the national government for foreign policy and international affairs, but leave almost everything else to the individual states. I think if we continue on the current path, there'll be ever more talk of secession, and it's frightening to think of where that could lead.
Mm-hmm. What is your most urgent message right now? Because you wrote this book, in 23, it came out last year, and things have changed since then. What is different today than when you wrote this?
When I wrote the book, it was based on the premise that there's a crisis facing American democracy. That crisis has only gotten worse since, and it's only been exacerbated since January 20th. Some of the crisis comes from the loss of faith that people have in the federal government and in the institutions of government. I think that loss of faith is going to further intensify. Some of the crisis of democracy comes from the deep divisions that exist in our society. They are only increasing. Can a democracy survive where people have lost faith in the government? Can a democracy survive where the people are so deeply divided? And can a democracy survive when there is a president who seems to have no commitment to democracy or the institutions of the Constitution?
Yeah, these are good questions. And I would probably say that it cannot survive. The democracy cannot survive in the onslaught of all of these that you just mentioned. Well, we are, however, a very hopeful podcast, and we also want to always inspire our audience to take civic action. So every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guest to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. So what's a good way to turn the insights that you've shared with us into action?
First, I think it's so important that people be informed. I've heard so many people say to me, well, the news is so depressing, I'm not reading or watching it. We don't have that luxury right now. Second, I think it's really important for people to be involved. We're all involved in groups and organizations. However they're focused, they should also have some attention paid to the issues of democracy. There are wonderful organizations that are fighting for our democracy. We need to support them. They can use volunteers. They can use financial support. And third, I think it's so important that people speak out. It's important to write your representative in Congress or your senator. It's important to sign petitions. It's important to go to rallies. Those things really matter.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, last question. Looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
I'll say two things. One is the past makes me hopeful for the future. The Constitution has proven remarkably resilient since 1787. There have been other crises of democracy. I think that we've gotten through them, that we can get through this one. If you look at the sweep of American history, there's been tremendous advances of equality, of freedom. I think Dr. King got it right when he said the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. The other thing that gives me hope is my students. They're incredibly idealistic, not necessarily optimistic, but seeing them and their passion gives me hope for the future.
Hear, hear. Actually, let me ask you one more thing. Is there anything else you would like to share before we close this conversation?
I think we've covered so much. I guess my bottom line message is there is a crisis facing democracy, but it's not hopeless, and that there is the opportunity for fixing the problems and really being true to the values that underlie the Constitution: democratic government, separation of powers and checks and balances, government under the rule of law, protecting personal freedoms, treating all people with decency and with equality. And so I think that the values are there, and now it's up to all of us to find ways for our government to be true to them.
Yes, totally agree. Thank you very much for joining me on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Truly my pleasure. Thank you.
Erwin Chemerinsky is Dean of the UC Berkeley School of Law. His most recent book is No Democracy Lasts Forever: How the Constitution Threatens the United States. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. Be informed. You may think the news is too bleak to pay attention to, but we don't have that luxury. Keep your ears perked to what's happening in the country right now and get involved in what matters to you. And finally, make your voice heard. Reach out to your elected representatives and share your priorities. Next week on Future Hindsight, we're sharing our fantastic conversation with Madiba Denny. She's an attorney, columnist, and professor whose work focuses on fostering an equitable, multiracial democracy. Her book is The Originalism Trap: How Extremists Stole the Constitution and How We the People Can Take It Back.
Originalism is the idea that the meaning of the Constitution is fixed in time. Originalists say that it is frozen at the moment of enactment. So at the time the Constitution was ratified, at latest 1868 or so, if we're talking about the Reconstruction Amendments. But for other parts of the Constitution, much earlier than that.
That's next time on Future Hindsight. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. We're your resource for all the tools you need to stay engaged. So follow Future Hindsight now, and we'll come right to you every week. And if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work that we do as an independent pro-democracy podcast, join the Civics Club on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/Future Hindsight now to join. Thanks for tuning in. And until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zach Travis and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.